Welcome back. I've been reviewing submissions this week, and one script kept pulling me back to a single detail: a backpacking permit. Never used, still folded inside a desk drawer, 7 years after it expired. The protagonist of this story did not scream. She did not confront anyone. She simply went back and took the trip. You're watching Historical Manhwa. The first thing Nora Lynn noticed when she opened her eyes on the trail was the smell of pine resin and cold river water. Not the antiseptic sting of a hospital corridor, not the flat chemical smell of her sister's baby formula, which had lived in her sinuses for what felt like 3 consecutive seasons of her life. Not the recycled office air of Chen and Hartwell Associates, where she had spent 11 years turning other people's mistakes into billable hours. Pine resin, cold river water, and somewhere beneath both of those, the faintly mineral smell of granite after a night of rain. She stood on the eastern ridge trailhead of the Cascades and did not move for a full 30 seconds. The weight of the pack on her shoulders, 42 liters, properly fitted, hip belt cinched exactly the way she had practiced in her apartment hallway 2 weeks ago, was real. The blister forming on her left heel, exactly where she'd told herself to use moleskin and then forgotten, was real. The pale blue quality of the early morning light filtering through the Douglas firs above her was real. She pressed one hand flat against the wooden trailhead sign, felt the grain of it, the slight give of weathered wood under her palm. Real. She had been dead. She was certain of this the same way she was certain of the weight on her shoulders, not because she could prove it with evidence, but because the body simply knows what it has been through. There is a texture to having been nothing, a residue of it that doesn't wash off cleanly. She carried it now the way you carry the memory of a bad dream 2 hours into a morning that is otherwise going well. She turned and looked back down the gravel access road toward the parking lot. Her car, the sensible gray sedan she had bought at 31 when she stopped pretending she would eventually buy something fun, sat alone in the lot. She had driven up at 4:30 in the morning. She had not told anyone where she was going. This, the two, was intentional. She turned back to the trail and began to walk. 7 years earlier, which was also, depending on how you accounted for time in a situation like this, approximately 3 weeks from now, calendar-wise, in the life she was currently living, Nora had stood in her kitchen at 6 in the morning making coffee when her phone rang. It was Vivian. This was not unusual. Vivian called at unusual hours with a frequency that suggested she had never fully absorbed the concept that other people had sleep schedules. What was unusual was that Vivian was crying, not the performative crying Nora had grown up cataloging. The theater of it, the strategic deployment of tears at dinner tables and in therapists' offices. This was a different kind. Thinner, higher pitched. "The night nurse canceled," Vivian said. She just texted, "The baby's been up since 2, and Marcus is useless, and I haven't slept, and I don't know what to do." Nora looked at her coffee, which was not yet finished brewing. She looked at the wall calendar where her trip was marked in green marker, a color she had chosen specifically because green meant go, green meant forward. Green meant yes to this thing she had planned for 8 months and saved for and quietly needed in a way she had not told anyone about, because needing things in her family had always been a liability. "When's your trip?" Vivian asked. She knew when the trip was. She had been told when the trip was. She was asking in the way that people ask questions they know the answers to, which is not really asking at all. "Thursday," Nora said. "Thursday?" A pause. Oh, a sound like Vivian was repositioning the baby. "Nora, I'm telling you right now that I'm struggling. I'm telling you. You know how hard it is for me to say that." Nora knew. She also knew that this was the 4th time in 18 months that Vivian had said exactly this, that it had each time resulted in Nora rearranging her own life to fill the space Vivian's needs created, and that the previous 3 instances had not been acknowledged, thanked, or even remembered with any consistency. She also knew that her mother would call within the hour, that her mother would say something like, "She's your sister and it's a newborn, and the trip will still be there." And that implicit in all of it was the unspoken family mathematics she had grown up with, where Vivian's needs were weighted and Nora's were theoretical. The coffee finished brewing. "I'll come Thursday morning," she said. "Give her a bath, let you sleep a few hours." "Could you maybe come Wednesday night? Just to help with the overnight feed?" The trip permit was non-refundable. She had known this when she bought it. She had made the decision with her eyes open, which is to say she had never quite believed, at the moment of purchase, that she would actually allow herself to go. She came Wednesday night. She did not go on Thursday. She did not reschedule. This was the lie she told herself at the time, that she would reschedule, that the mountains were not going anywhere, that she was 31 years old and had decades of trail ahead of her. The mountains were not going anywhere. That part was true. The decades, it turned out, were not the reliable currency she had assumed them to be. She had died in a car accident on a Tuesday afternoon in November, in the 38th year of her life. It was not dramatic. It was the kind of accident that happens at an intersection where someone runs a light they had watched turn yellow from 40 feet away and made the calculation that they could make it. The calculation was wrong. Nora's sedan, the sensible gray one, was T-boned on the driver's side at 35 miles per hour. She remembered the sound, not the impact itself, but the strange high frequency of crumpling metal, which she had not expected to sound almost musical. And then nothing. For what felt like no time at all, and then the smell of pine resin and cold river water. She had not wasted any time on disbelief. Disbelief is a luxury for people who have the option of not believing. She had opened her eyes in her own apartment, in her own bed at age 31, 3 days before her backpacking permit expired, and she had lain completely still for exactly 11 minutes looking at the ceiling, running through everything she knew. Then she had gotten up, made coffee, and Anne started writing a list. The trail climbed steeply for the first 2 miles. This was the section most people described as the deterrent, the part that separated the people who thought they wanted to do this from the people who actually did. She moved through it steadily, not fast, setting a pace she could maintain for 6 hours without burning out. The technique was familiar, even though the body carrying it was 7 years younger than the one she'd last used. The muscles remembered differently at 31. There was a buoyancy to it she hadn't expected to feel again. Around the 3rd mile, where the trail leveled out briefly before the next climb, and a stand of old-growth cedar gave the path a cathedral quality, light falling in columns through the canopy, the ground below soft with decades of needle fall, she heard someone behind her. Not fast, not aggressive, just the steady rhythm of someone who was also doing this correctly. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. She had 7 years of knowing who it was. She let him gain on her slowly, which he would do anyway because he was taller and his natural stride was longer, and he did not know yet that the woman ahead of him with the gray pack and the slightly imperfect posture was anyone other than a stranger on a trail. She heard him slow as he drew parallel with her. "Your left shoulder is compensating," he said. Not an intrusion, so more like someone noting a tool is being used wrong. "Your pack fits right, but you're carrying something tense up there." She looked at him. He was exactly as she remembered. Not handsome in the catalog way. Something more specific than that. The kind of face that got better the more you looked at it, that revealed itself incrementally. Callum Reed, 34. He ran a small environmental consulting firm in Portland that he had built from scratch after spending 3 years working for a much larger firm that had asked him to sign off on reports he believed were misleading. He had not signed. He had left. He had been correct about the reports, which a state audit had confirmed 2 years later. She knew this because in her previous life, after the accident, she had, for reasons she couldn't entirely rationalize, looked up the man she had met briefly at a work conference 8 years prior who had said something quietly devastating about the difference between being technically accurate and being honest. She had never been able to find exactly why that had stayed with her. She had found his name in an old email chain. She had looked him up mostly to confirm he was real. He had gotten married. To someone else. Happily by all appearances. She had felt something reading that, which she had classified as irrelevant and filed accordingly. "Old habit," she said now, on the trail. "Left hand carrying. You're a lawyer." Was that a guess? You carry a bag on your left shoulder to keep your right hand free? And the way you just looked at me was about 70% assessment, 30% response. He wasn't smiling, but there was something around his eyes that wasn't neutral. Callum Reed. Nora Lynn. They walked in silence for a while, which was a specific kind of silence. Not uncomfortable, not empty. The kind that has weight to it. The trail required attention. There was a reason to look at the ground, and the silence could live inside that reason without becoming awkward. "How many days?" he asked. 7. "Solo?" "Yes." He considered this. I'm doing 6, the North Ridge Loop. That's the better route? It's longer? Yes. Another silence. The trail began to climb again. She could feel the exact moment her pack shifted in response to the incline, the hip belt doing its work. The blister on her left heel was becoming something she would need to address at the next rest stop. She made a note of this in the precise, unemotional way she made notes of most things now, which was a skill she had spent her previous life developing professionally and had apparently exported into this new arrangement she was operating under. "Oh, you've done this trail?" he asked. "No," she said, which was true. She had studied it for 8 months before the permit, then put the maps away when she'd canceled, then taken them out again 18 months before her accident, when she'd registered for a different, easier version of the same trip that she'd also ultimately not taken. She knew the trail the way she knew a lot of things. In theory, in careful preparation, without the actual experience. "It's worth it," Callum said. "Oh, even the rough part on day 4. The false summit? The second false summit. The first one everyone expects. The second one is where people decide things." She looked at him. He was looking at the trail ahead, navigating a route that crossed the path at a complicated angle. He stepped over it without breaking rhythm. "Decide things?" she repeated. "Whether they're the kind of person who continues or the kind who turns around. It's not about fitness at that point. It's about what you think you owe yourself." She had not expected that. Or rather, she had known something like it was coming because she had 7 years of hindsight on this man and on her own feelings about him. But she had not expected it to land this cleanly at the 3rd mile. She looked back at the trail. "I'm the kind who continues," she said. "I know," he said. "That was obvious from the 1st mile." They camped near each other that night without planning it. Which is to say they arrived at the same clearing around the same time and acknowledged this with a brief nod and set up their respective tents without discussion. He had a small stove and made pour-over coffee, which she could smell from 15 feet away. She had instant coffee in a foil packet, which had been a deliberate choice in her original packing. Not because she preferred it, but because she'd been the kind of person who packed the practical thing even when the good thing was available. She was trying to stop being that person. It was harder than she'd expected. "You're welcome to real coffee," he said without looking up from what he was doing. She walked over and sat on a log across from his camp stove. "Thank you," she said. "You don't say that easily." "No." He poured water from a titanium pot into the filter. The coffee smell intensified. Above them, the sky had gone from blue to the particular shade of dark, blue-gray that happens in mountains about 20 minutes before stars appear, that transitional quality of light that makes everything look slightly more real than usual. "What kind of law?" he asked. "Corporate, mergers, acquisitions, some estate work." "Do you like it?" The question surprised her, not because it was unusual, but because of the directness of it. No preamble, no softening. He asked it the way you'd ask someone if they'd like sugar in their coffee. A simple information-gathering question. "I'm good at it," she said. "That's not what I asked." She accepted the cup he handed her, wrapped both hands around it. The ceramic was warm against her palms, and the coffee was darker and richer than anything she had brewed for herself in years, which was a small detail but felt in this moment like something larger. "I like the strategy of it," she said. "Finding the thing that's technically true that changes everything. The small clause in a document that nobody read carefully enough." She paused. "I don't like what it's for most of the time. Who it protects." He nodded. Not a performative nod. A nod that meant he had received the information and placed it accurately. "Environmental consulting," she said. "Yes. Do you like it?" "When the client is actually trying to do the right thing." He poured his own coffee. "Oh, which is less often than you'd hope." "And when they're not?" "Then I write a report that tells them exactly what they're doing and exactly what it will cost. And usually they find someone else." "Do you mind?" "Every time," he said. "And then I remember that the report exists, and that records exist, and that there are regulators whose job it is to eventually find records." He looked up at her. "So no, not really." She thought about this, about records, and the ways that information survives the people who create it, and about how that was exactly the mechanism she was planning to use against 2 specific people in her life whose behavior had been, for the 7 years she had been able to observe it at close range, carefully constructed to leave no records at all. She thought about Vivian's husband, Marcus Chen, no relation, who managed the family's real estate holdings, which had belonged to their mother, and which their mother had transferred into a family trust 8 years ago, with the help of an estate attorney named Howard Parrish, who was not the most scrupulous practitioner in the state. She thought about what she knew about that trust, and about Howard Parrish, and about the specific way the transfer had been structured so that Vivian, as the trustee's chosen manager, they had what amounted to operational control of assets that were supposed to be distributed equally between both sisters. She had found this out in her previous life at 36, when her mother had died suddenly from a stroke, and Nora had requested a copy of the estate documents, and had read them, and had understood, with the specific, cold, delayed understanding that corporate lawyers develop over years of practice, exactly what had been done. By then, it was complicated. By then, there were tax filings and transactions, and 5 years of decisions layered over each other in ways that took Nora 8 months to fully document. By then, Marcus had already sold 2 of the 4 properties. By then, Vivian had looked at Nora across a kitchen table and said with genuine seeming confusion that she didn't understand what Nora was upset about, that Mom had always said the properties should go to whoever managed them, that Nora hadn't been around much anyway. In her previous life, Nora had spent those 8 months building a case and then not filed it, because filing it meant going to war with the only family she had, and because she had not yet fully understood what that family had been for the entire duration of her life, which was a convenience, a tool, a resource to be drawn on. She understood it now. She sipped the coffee. "These are good," she said, meaning the beans. "Where do you get them?" "There's a roaster in Northeast Portland." "Though a small place. Woman who sources directly from farms she's visited." He named the street. "You're in Portland?" "Seattle, but I can order online." "I'll send you the website," he said, and then seemed to remember they had exchanged no contact information. A brief, almost imperceptible recalibration. "If that, yes," she said. "I'd like that." She had 6 days on the trail, and she spent them doing 2 things, walking and planning. The walking was for reasons that were harder to articulate. Something about the specific mechanics of placing one foot in front of the other on uneven ground, of making 10,000 small adjustments per hour that were below conscious processing, that freed the upper levels of the mind for the kind of thinking that didn't happen well in offices or apartments. She had always known this about herself, in a vague way. She was understanding it precisely now. The planning was for Vivian and Marcus, and for Howard Parrish, and for the financial architecture they had built together over the course of 9 years on the foundation of a family trust that had been improperly executed in ways that were, as it happened, quite specific and quite documentable. She was a corporate lawyer with 11 years of experience. She had spent 3 of those years doing estate litigation for a partner who specialized in trust disputes. She knew exactly what an improperly executed trust looked like from the outside, and she knew exactly how to get inside it. And she knew this was the part that had taken her 8 months in her previous life and would now take her approximately 4 weeks. Which specific provisions of the state's trust code had been violated in ways that created standing for a challenge. The trust had been established under RCW 1.98, the state's Trust and Estate Dispute Resolution Act. The Howard Parrish had structured it with Vivian as trustee and had included a provision granting the trustee unilateral authority to make distributions in the interest of trust purposes, which was a phrase so vague as to be meaningless, and which had never been properly challenged because Nora had not been watching carefully enough, and their mother had trusted Vivian in ways that had never been subjected to daylight. The problems were specific. First, the trust had been established without proper independent counsel for the grantor, their mother, which was a procedural requirement under Washington state law when the drafting attorney also had a pre-existing relationship with a beneficiary. Howard Parrish had represented Marcus Chen in a commercial real estate transaction 2 years prior. This had not been disclosed. Second, the power of attorney that had been executed simultaneously with the trust had been witnessed by Marcus Chen, and who was a beneficiary's spouse, which in Washington created a rebuttable presumption of undue influence. Third, the 2 property sales Marcus had executed, one in her previous life, both of which she now needed to prevent, had been at below-market values to LLCs that, when examined carefully, had beneficial ownership structures that traced back to a holding company with which Marcus had a consulting relationship. Self-dealing, not subtle self-dealing. The kind that is not subtle specifically because the people doing it have calculated that no one is going to look. She was going to look. On the fourth day, she reached the second false summit. Callum had been right about it. The first false summit was well marked on every trail guide and enthusiastically discussed in every online trip report she'd read, and so when you crested it and saw the actual peak still ahead, you had already prepared for that. You had built it into your expectations. It was disappointing in a manageable way. The second false summit was unmarked. It appeared after a section of trail that was genuinely punishing, steep, loose-rocked, requiring attention at every step. And when you emerged from that section onto what felt unmistakably like a peak, with the kind of view that justified peaks, with the light hitting correctly and the wind dying for a moment, you stopped. You breathed. You looked around, and then you looked ahead, and the mountain continued. Oh, she stood there for a long moment. The thing about the second false summit was not that it was harder than the first. It was that it found you at a different point. By the fourth day, the body has made its adjustments. The muscles have learned what is required. The blisters have either resolved or been taped into submission. You are, in a purely physical sense, more capable on day 4 than you were on day 1. But you are also carrying 4 days of accumulated effort. Oh, and you know exactly how many miles remain, and the calculation is honest in a way it wasn't at the beginning. She looked ahead. She continued. Callum found her at the summit on day 5. She had reached it an hour before him and was sitting on a flat section of rock with her pack off, eating an energy bar, watching a pair of Clark's nutcrackers do something complicated with a pine cone 30 feet below her. The sky was the specific pale blue-white that exists only above 8,000 feet. The air tasted like nothing, which was its own kind of taste. She heard his boots on the last section of trail and did not turn around. "You did it," he said. "I continued," she corrected. He sat down, not next to her, but nearby, within conversation range. He was breathing hard in a controlled way, the kind of breathing that means you've been moving fast and have chosen to regulate it rather than show it. He pulled off his pack, rolled his shoulders, looked at the view. "Different up here," he said. "Everything looks flat. The things that looked like walls from below." She ate the rest of her energy bar. He ate something from a pouch. Below them, in 3 different directions, the world arranged itself into the kind of landscape that makes scale feel meaningless. Ridgelines folding into each other, valleys catching different qualities of light, a river somewhere to the north that was only visible as a reflective line. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Yes. If you found out that something had been done to someone's financial situation, their inheritance, something like that, and you knew it had been done deliberately, and you knew the mechanism, but it had been done by family members, and nobody was going to bring it forward because nobody wanted the war." She stopped. Reset. "If you knew all of that, and you had the technical ability to address it, what would you do?" He was quiet for a while. This was something she had noticed about him over 5 days. He did not fill silences reflexively. He let them exist until he had something accurate to say. "I'd address it," he said, "even at the cost of the relationship. If the relationship was already costing you at that level, addressing it isn't losing the relationship. It's calling it what it already is." She looked at him. "The thing about not acting on what you know," he continued, "is that you think you're preserving something. But you're not. You're just paying for it differently." She turned back to the view. A cloud shadow moved across a lower ridge, going south. The nutcrackers were still working on the pine cone. "What if the person the harm was done to is no longer alive to participate in addressing it?" she said. Another silence. "Then you're doing it for the record," he said. "Not for them. The record still matters." She thought about Howard Parish, and about the State Bar's trust in a state section, and about the Washington State Attorney General's office, and about the forensic accountant she had hired in her previous life for 8 months of work that had ultimately produced a report she had never filed. She thought about that report, which she still knew the contents of, which she could reconstruct, and about the improvements she would make to it this time, and about the 4-week timeline she had already mapped to execute everything before the first property sale could happen. She thought about what it had cost her, not in money, not in time, but in the particular currency of a woman who has been told her entire life that her needs are theoretical, to not file it, the math of that, the ongoing interest of it. For the record, she said, yes. And if the record produces outcomes, then those are outcomes that already existed. You're just surfacing them. She nodded. Below them, the cloud shadow reached the valley floor and began to lighten. She was back in Seattle on a Thursday morning, 7 days after she'd left. Her apartment was exactly as she'd left it, which she noted with a small amount of irony. In her previous life, she had received 3 calls from Vivian during the first week of the trip she'd never taken, each escalating in urgency. The silence this time felt like its own kind of information. She showered, changed, made real coffee in the stovetop mocha pot she'd owned for years and consistently underused because it required more attention than the drip machine, and sat at her kitchen table with a legal pad and began the work. The work was layered, and it would take exactly as long as it took. First layer, documentation. She spent 2 weeks pulling every publicly available record on the trust, the properties, and Howard Parrish's professional history. Washington's real estate and trust records were partially public. The property transactions were fully public. Howard Parrish's bar record, which she had not thought to check in her previous life until very late, was available through the Washington State Bar Association and revealed 2 prior disciplinary complaints, one from 15 years ago about commingling of client funds, one from 8 years ago that had been resolved with a private reprimand. Neither had resulted in suspension. Both indicated a pattern. She requested a copy of the trust document itself through her mother, which required a conversation she had prepared for carefully. Her mother received her in the front room of the house, which always felt to Nora like a museum of Vivian's achievements. The framed photos, the children's drawings now replaced by adult accomplishments, the evidence everywhere of a narrative in which Vivian was the central figure and Nora was a supporting role. She had spent her entire childhood in this house being shaped by this narrative and had spent her entire adulthood accepting its terms. She sat down, she accepted the tea. She said very calmly that she was doing some financial planning of her own and wanted to understand the family trust structure as a beneficiary. Her mother's expression had shifted in a way that was interesting to observe when you were watching for it. Not alarm exactly, something more calculated than alarm. A brief assessment period, after which her mother had said, with warmth that had a structural quality to it, that Vivian managed all of that and Nora should ask Vivian. I would, Nora said, but I wanted to look at the original documents first. I'm entitled to request a copy as a named beneficiary. It's a standard right under state law. Her mother looked at her. Her mother had a way of looking at Nora that had always communicated a kind of faint bewilderment, as though Nora were a species of problem she had never quite learned to manage. Nora had spent 30 years finding this look painful in ways she couldn't always name. She found it interesting now. She found it diagnostic. I'll have Marcus send you what he has, her mother said. That would be fine, Nora said, or you could simply contact Howard Parrish's office directly and request a copy. You're the grantor. You have absolute right of access. Her mother blinked. I'll have Marcus look into it, her mother said. Marcus, of course, would not look into it. Marcus would call Vivian, and Vivian would call their mother back. And within 24 hours, there would be a family communication, possibly directed at Nora, possibly conducted around her, about how Nora was being difficult, which was a word that had followed her through childhood like a weather pattern, deployed whenever she declined to arrange herself for other people's convenience. She expected all of this. She did not need the copy from Marcus. She had already retained a probate litigation attorney named Sandra Coe, who had 15 years of trust dispute experience, an excellent record with the Washington State Superior Court, and a reputation for a very specific kind of methodical aggression that Nora recognized as kindred to her own. She had retained Sandra on a Monday morning, laid out the full situation over 90 minutes with documentation she had already organized. Had watched Sandra read through it with increasing attention. This is not subtle, Sandra had said about the self-dealing. No, Nora agreed. The power of attorney issue is actually the cleanest entry point. The witness problem is textbook. Sandra had looked up. How long have you known about this? Long enough, Nora said. And the properties haven't been sold yet? No. Good, because once they're transferred, we're fighting a different war. Sandra had set down the document. Yeah, I want a forensic accountant on the trust's cash flow, and I want to depose Howard Parrish before he has any idea this is coming. The bar complaint goes simultaneously, Nora said. Yes, and we don't warn anyone first. Sandra had looked at her in the way that professionals sometimes look at each other when they recognize a shared understanding of how something must be handled. Are you prepared for how your family will respond to this? Yes, Nora said, because she was. Because she had already done this in one version of her life, in the wrong way, too late, too softly, and she knew exactly what it felt like to be unprepared for that response. She had already paid that price. She was not paying it again. The forensic accountant was a woman named Elena Park, who worked out of a small office in Bellevue and had previously worked for the IRS for 12 years before going private. She had the specific quality of someone who has spent a decade being professionally unimpressed by human creative accounting, which is to say she was very difficult to surprise. Nora sat across from her and walked her through the trust structure, the property valuations, and the LLC ownership question, and watched Elena take notes with the efficiency of someone who had heard this story before. The below-market sales are the most actionable, Elena said. If the buying entities tie back to Marcus or anyone connected to him, that's textbook self-dealing and it triggers breach of fiduciary duty. We'll need to trace the LLC beneficial ownership, which is harder since 2018 but not impossible. The formation documents were filed in Delaware, Nora said, but the registered agent is a firm I've used professionally. I know how to read their organizational structure. Elena had looked at her over the top of her reading glasses. Oh, you've done this kind of work before. Adjacent to it. The sales prices, where did you get the comparables? County assessor records. I pulled everything within a quarter mile. Same square footage range, same year sold. The gap is substantial on both properties. She slid the analysis across the table. Property 1 sold at 22% below median. Property 2, which hasn't sold yet in the current timeline, was listed at a number that doesn't reflect the commercial development potential of the lot, which increased significantly when the zoning board approved the mixed-use reclassification last spring. Elena looked at the numbers. Nobody told the trust about the rezoning, she said. It was not quite a question. The rezoning was approved 6 weeks after Marcus listed the property at the pre-rezoning valuation, Nora said. He filed the listing documents before the rezoning. He knew the decision was coming because he attended the zoning board meeting. Elena set down the papers. She leaned back in her chair. He listed it cheap before the value went up, so he could buy it cheap. Through an LLC that has a consulting agreement with a holding company of which he is a 1/3 beneficial owner, yes. How did you find the consulting agreement? I looked for it, Nora said simply. Elena looked at her for a long moment with the expression of someone professionally calibrating how much they need to know. I'll have a complete financial analysis in 3 weeks, she said. I'll need it in 2, Nora said. The property is still listed, and I have reason to believe the sale will close within 6 weeks if we don't move. Elena nodded once. 2 weeks? The bar complaint against Howard Parrish went to the Washington State Bar Association on a Wednesday. It was 19 pages, organized with the kind of clarity that comes from having spent 11 years reading and drafting documents that could not afford to be unclear. It documented the pre-existing relationship between Parrish and Marcus Chen, the failure to disclose, the grantor's lack of independent counsel, and the 2 prior disciplinary complaints with citations to the relevant bar rules. The bar's trust and estate section received it at 9:15 in the morning. At noon that same day, Sandra co-filed the petition to challenge the trust in King County Superior Court on grounds of undue influence and improper execution. Nora was in her office when this happened, not her law firm's office, but a private desk she rented in a co-working space downtown for reasons of both practicality and containment. She did not want the matter touching her professional relationships at Chen and Hartwell until she had more distance from it. At noon, she received a text from Sandra saying simply, "Filed." She closed her eyes for 3 seconds, then opened them and went back to work. The response came from Vivian's end in under 48 hours. Her mother called first. This was expected. Her mother's voice had the quality of someone who had been given specific instructions about what to say and was executing them with the particular tonal care of a person who believes the person on the other end cannot detect that. Nora, her mother said. Whatever is going on with this legal thing, whatever you've been told or think you know, your sister is devastated. You've done something that has deeply hurt this family. The court documents are a matter of public record, Nora said. I can send you the filing if you'd like to understand what the case is about. I don't need documents. I need to know why you're doing this. Because it's accurate, Nora said. And because I'm entitled to. A silence. Not the heavy, grieved silence her mother perhaps intended it to sound like. Nora had learned over a lifetime of conversations with her mother to separate the performed emotion from the information within it. And the information in this silence was, we did not expect this, and we are not sure how to counter it, and we need time. Your father, her mother began. Dad has been gone for 15 years, Nora said, and the trust was created after his death. It doesn't invoke his memory. Another silence, shorter. You're being very cold, her mother said. I'm being very precise, Nora said. They're not the same. Vivian called 20 minutes later, while their mother was presumably still processing the call. Vivian's approach was different. Vivian had always understood, with an instinct that was almost impressive, that different pressure points required different tools, and that the tool that worked on their mother, the appeal to family unity, no, the deployment of hurt feelings, did not work on Nora in the same way. What Vivian used on Nora was a kind of flat directness that mimicked transparency, but was not. You want to tell me what this is actually about? Vivian said. I think the filing is clear. This is about the trip, isn't it? I've always known you resented that. This was a tactic Nora had watched Vivian use throughout their adult lives, a kind of preemptive personalization that reframed objective harm as private grievance. It worked most effectively on people who were more uncertain about their own perceptions than about external fact. Nora had for a long time been exactly that person. The filing is about the trust, she said. If you want to discuss the trip, we can do that separately. This is insane. This is years of... You're acting like I'm some kind of criminal. I'm acting like someone who read the documents, Nora said. If there's a factual error in the complaint, tell Sandra Coe. She's the attorney of record. Her contact information is on the filing. You hired Nora. She's very good, Nora said. You should hire someone equally good. She ended the call. She put her phone face down on the desk. She sat still for a moment in the way she had been practicing. Not suppressing, not performing calm, but actually settling into the specific quality of having done the thing you've been planning and finding that the ground is where you expected it to be when you landed. She picked up the phone and sent a text to Callum Reed, whose number she'd collected at the end of the trail, telling him that the coffee roaster's website was excellent and that she had placed an order. He replied, "How was the rest of the trip?" She replied, "I continued." 3 seconds later, "I know. How was the second summit?" She looked at this for a moment. "The view you described," she wrote back, and then, "Thank you. You're welcome," he wrote. "Come back to Portland sometime." "Oh, the coffee is better in person." She smiled. Not a performance of smiling. The actual thing. The Superior Court hearing on the preliminary injunction was in 6 weeks. The injunction would prevent the second property from being sold pending the outcome of the trust challenge. Sandra had said, reviewing the filing, that the injunction was highly likely to be granted given the active listing and the documented self-dealing evidence. The substantive case would take longer. Trust challenges are not quick. But the injunction was the immediate goal, the wall between now and the sale. Elena Park delivered her forensic analysis in 13 days, 2 days ahead of the 2-week deadline, which Nora filed as a supplemental exhibit. The analysis was 68 pages and confirmed everything Nora had mapped on her legal pad at the kitchen table. The below-market sale of the first property at a 22% discount. And the LLC ownership structure tracing back through 3 entities and 1 management consulting agreement to Marcus Chen's beneficial interest. The second property's improper valuation in light of the zoning change. A third finding Nora had not anticipated, a pattern of trust disbursements to property management expenses that, when examined against actual vendor invoices, included approximately $40,000 in charges from a company that had no verifiable employees. The no physical address, and a registered agent in Nevada who also served as the registered agent for 12 other entities, 3 of which appeared in Marcus Chen's professional history. The $40,000 was not, in the scale of the estate, An enormous number. But it was the kind of number that explained everything about the kind of operation being run. It was the number you left in place when you were confident no one would ever look. When Elena had sent the final analysis, then she had included a personal note at the bottom that said, "I've seen versions of this in 14 different trust disputes. Usually by the time someone calls me, 2 or 3 properties are already gone." Good timing. Nora had read this 3 times. Good timing, she had thought. That was one way to put it. Marcus Chen retained a firm called Delancey and Morrison, which was large and competent and primarily used by people who needed the appearance of competence more than competence itself. Their response to the trust challenge was 22 pages of procedural objections and an affidavit from Marcus asserting that all transactions had been conducted in the best interest of the trust and that Nora Lynn's challenge was motivated by personal animus and a pattern of disengagement from family responsibilities. Sandra Coe had read the response and said, "They're going to try to make this about you personally," Nora had said. "They always do." And then after a pause, "It's fine." It was fine because Nora had documentation and Delancey and Morrison had an affidavit from a man whose financial activities did not support the story in the affidavit, and in Nora's experience, that was almost always a losing arrangement for the affidavit. Howard Parish's bar counsel had also responded to the complaint with a letter characterizing the oversight as technical and inadvertent and noting the years of professional service, blah, blah, blah. She had read this letter and filed it. The bar's investigation would take time. That was also fine. The property sat unsold pending the injunction hearing. Marcus had called the listing agent and requested a halt, which was the response of a man who had been told by his lawyers to stop moving money. This was the correct advice, and also, from Nora's perspective, exactly the right outcome. She went to Portland on a Saturday. Not for this. Or not only for this. Callum Reed's office was in a converted warehouse in the Pearl District. The kind of building that had been industrial and was now occupied by the kind of businesses that care about materials and light. She was not there to see his office. She was there because he had said come back to Portland sometime, and she had decided that she was the kind of person who continued. They met at a coffee shop 2 blocks from the roaster he'd mentioned. Not the roaster itself, which she had suggested, but a different shop that he preferred, he said. Because the owners played better music and the chairs were less self-conscious. She had looked at the chairs when she arrived and found she agreed. He was already there when she arrived, which she had not expected. Not because she thought he would be late, but because she had arrived 8 minutes early, which was her standard. He was the kind of man who arrived 9 minutes early and was reading something on paper, not a phone, when the person he was meeting walked in. He looked up. He looked unsurprised to see her, and also, beneath the unsurprised surface, something else. Something that was quieter than pleased and more sustainable. "You came," he said. "I said I would." "People say that." "I mean it when I say it," she said, and sat down across from him. The coffee was, as promised, better in person. They talked for 3 hours, which she had not planned and did not mind. He was working on an assessment for a state agency on riparian buffer zones along the Willamette, which was work he clearly found genuinely engaging, and she listened to him describe it with the specific attention she gave to things that were worth understanding. She told him about the trust challenge in broad outline, without identifying her family or the specifics, framing it as a case she was involved in professionally. He listened the way he always listened, without interruption, with full attention. "Does it feel like the right thing?" he asked. "Oh, or just the accurate thing?" She thought about this. "Both," she said. "But I've been thinking about the distinction. The distinction matters. Yes, the accurate thing without the right thing is just winning. The right thing without the accurate thing is just," she searched, "just wanting something. And when they're the same, then it's clean," she said. "Then you can do it without having to manage how you feel about it." He looked at her for a moment. The afternoon light from the window to her right was catching the side of his face and doing something with it that she tried not to pay attention to and paid attention to anyway. "How often do you get to work on the clean ones?" he asked. "More than I used to," she said. "I'm getting better at choosing." They walked afterward through the Pearl and down toward the river, which was high and fast with the spring runoff. He knew the city in the specific way of someone who has learned it through years of walking it rather than driving, and he pointed out things she wouldn't have seen on her own. A building facade that had been preserved inside a newer structure, a community garden that occupied the footprint of a demolished building, a view corridor that the city had protected through zoning so that you could always see Mount Hood from this specific corner. "You notice things," she said. "It's the work. Oh, you have to look at what's actually there, not what the documentation says is there." She thought about documentation. She thought about the $40,000 in ghost vendor payments. She thought about a man who had calculated for years that no one was going to look, and about the way that calculation felt from the inside to the person being looked at. Not fear initially, confusion. The confusion of someone who has built a system predicated on a certain kind of invisibility. Confronting the fact of visibility. She had looked. She was still looking. "What made you leave the big firm?" she asked, not because she didn't know, because she wanted to hear it from him, directly in the version he told. "The reports," he said, signing off on conclusions I couldn't support. He was quiet for a moment. The specific thing was a wetlands assessment in Clark County. The client was a developer. The wetlands were significant, not legally protected at the threshold they were claiming, but significant in ways that mattered ecologically. My report said that. He paused. My boss revised my report. "What did you do?" "I kept my original version, kept every draft, kept every email." He looked at the river. "And then I left. And the original version is on record with the state agency that did the environmental review 6 months later. When the county sued the developer over the drainage issues." He looked at her. "Records exist. Even when people try to erase them. Especially then, erasure leaves evidence of erasure." She thought about the $40,000, and about the ghost vendor, and about the 12 LLC entities sharing a registered agent in Nevada, and about all the ways that attempting to not leave a trace guarantees that you leave a specific and identifiable kind of trace. "Yes," she said. They had dinner, which was also not planned and also fine, at a small place near his office that he described as honest. Not a word she'd heard used about restaurants before, but that proved in practice to be accurate. The menu was short and exactly correct. The space was not attempting to be anything. The food was what it said it was. She drove back to Seattle at 9 o'clock, when the mountain passes were clear and the highway had that quality of nighttime openness that doesn't exist during the day. Today, she had the mocha pot coffee in a travel thermos. The mountains were dark masses against a slightly lighter sky. She thought about Callum's question, does it feel like the right thing, or just the accurate thing? Both, she had said. She thought now about what both actually meant. She thought about the original version of her life, the one in which she had canceled the trip and spent 7 years as a resource, as a support structure, was the person who did not need things or was careful not to demonstrate needing them. She thought about the night nurse who had canceled, and the 6 a.m. phone call, and the permit she had folded into a drawer. She thought about what it had cost her in the original version of events. The trip, obviously, but not only the trip. Something else, something harder to itemize. The decision, 7 years across, compounding to be the kind of person whose needs were theoretical. To participate in the family mathematics in which Vivian's weight was measurable and Nora's was not. She thought about what Callum had said about paying for things, about the difference between preserving a relationship and paying for it. The thing about her family, in its original configuration, was that it had never been a relationship in any meaningful sense. It had been a system. Systems can be assessed and documented and challenged in court and restructured in ways that relationships sometimes cannot. This was both colder and more honest than the way she had previously thought about it. The trust challenge was about assets and breach of fiduciary duty and the specific procedural failures of Howard Parish. It was also, under all of that, about a 40-year pattern of how Nora's portion of the family's material world had been treated as available for redistribution, and about the way that pattern had been made possible by Nora's own participation in it, and about the end of that participation. She drove through the pass and down into the Seattle Basin with the lights of the city growing below her, and she felt, for the first time in either version of her life that she could clearly remember, the specific quality of being entirely where she intended to be. The injunction was granted on a Tuesday morning. Sandra called her with the news. Reading from the judge's ruling, petitioner has demonstrated sufficient probability of success on the merits and risk of irreparable harm through the potential sale of trust assets pending determination of the underlying challenge. The property was frozen, the listing was suspended. Marcus Chen's attorneys filed a motion to reconsider the same afternoon. This was procedurally available to them. And also, Sandra said, not going to work given the evidentiary record already in front of the court. Vivian texted Nora 2 words. Congratulations, nice. Nora did not respond. The text had the quality of an expletive with the profanity removed, which she found almost interesting. So Howard Parish's bar counsel sent a follow-up letter acknowledging potential procedural irregularities in the trust drafting and requesting an opportunity to meet with bar investigators to provide context. This was the language of a man whose attorney had read the 19-page complaint and had made an assessment about how it would be received. Her mother did not call for 11 days. When she did, her voice had a quality Nora had not heard before. Not the performed warmth or the strategic grief or the bewilderment. Something more stripped than any of those. Something that was either genuine or a more sophisticated performance than Nora had previously seen from her, which she acknowledged was possible. I want to understand what happened with the trust, her mother said, not from Vivian or Marcus, from the documents. Nora had prepared for several versions of this conversation. This version was not the one she had prepared for most, which told her something. I'll send you Sandra's full filing, she said. It includes the forensic accounting report. It's specific. I trusted Howard, her mother said. He was with the firm your father used? Yes, Nora said. That was what was being traded on. A silence, a long one. I didn't know, her mother said. Nora considered this. She was a corporate lawyer with 11 years of experience assessing what people knew and when they knew it. She was also the daughter of this woman, which was a different kind of assessment with less clean edges. I believe you didn't know about the vendor payments, she said. I'm less certain about the property sales. Another silence. Vivian told me Marcus found good buyers, her mother said. At the prices? We're below fair market value by documented margins, Nora said. The forensic report compares against sales within the same quarter. The gap is in the exhibit. Her mother did not respond immediately. What happens now? Her mother finally asked. The trust challenge proceeds. If the court finds breach of fiduciary duty, which I believe it will, the court can remove the trustee, require an accounting, and order disgorgement of any self-dealing proceeds. The bar investigation of Howard Parish continues separately. She paused. If Marcus cooperates with the accounting, it goes faster and costs less for everyone. And if he doesn't, then we take his deposition. A very long silence. You've changed, her mother said. I've stayed the same, Nora said. You've just seen a different part. The substantive trust case settled 11 months later. It did not go to trial because Marcus Chen's attorneys advised settlement after Elena Park's deposition, in which Elena had spent 6 hours methodically walking through 68 pages of forensic analysis with the flat, unimpressed effect of a person who has done this before and finds the quality of the creative accounting in this particular case to be, if anything, slightly below average. The settlement included disgorgement of the proceeds from the first property sale, redistribution of trust assets to correct the improper disbursements, removal of Marcus Chen as property manager, and appointment of a court-supervised professional trustee. Vivian signed the settlement documents. She did not speak to Nora for the next 2 years, which was described by their mutual acquaintances as a tragedy, and was experienced by Nora as a change in weather. Howard Parish received a formal reprimand from the Washington State Bar and a 1-year probationary supervision of his estate practice. It was less than what he deserved and more than he had received the first 2 times. His reputation in the estate planning community, which was small and talkative, was permanently altered. 3 of his clients retained new counsel within 6 months of the bar's public ruling. This, too, was a form of record. Her mother called Nora, after the settlement was finalized, to say that she had contacted a different estate attorney, one she'd found independently without Marcus's involvement, and that she was having her documents reviewed. She said this with the specific brevity of someone reporting an action rather than requesting credit for it. Good, Nora said. Let me know if you want a second opinion on anything they tell you. I might, her mother said. Nora, she waited. "The trip," her mother said. "The backpacking trip. I knew you really wanted to go. I knew when you said you'd come for the baby that you were—" A pause. "I should have said no to Vivian." "Yes," Nora said. "I'm sorry." Nora held the phone for a moment. The afternoon light was coming through her apartment window at the angle it only hit in late October, long and golden and not quite warm. On her kitchen counter was a bag of coffee from the Portland roaster, which she had been ordering monthly for almost a year. "I went," she said, eventually. "Was it good?" "Yes," she said. "It was exactly what I'd planned." The Portland apartment was on the 3rd floor of a building near the river, in a neighborhood she had come to know over the course of 14 months of deliberate becoming familiar with, which is different from simply visiting. It had 2 windows that faced east, which meant the light came in early, and a kitchen that was small, but correctly proportioned, which mattered to her more than size had previously. Callum's office was 12 minutes away on foot, which she knew because she had walked it enough times to have learned the route's variables. The intersection at Glisten that could add 3 minutes in the morning, the shortcut through the parking structure that saved 2 on rainy days. She was not living with him yet. That was a different timeline, a different set of deliberate choices that had not been made because they had not been ready yet. Which was a state of things she had come to find acceptable in a way she would not have been able to in her previous life before she understood the difference between waiting and being patient. But she was in Portland. She was in the apartment with the east-facing windows. The bag of coffee on the counter was from the roaster 2 blocks away, the small place with the woman who sourced directly from farms she'd visited. She bought it in person now, on Saturday mornings. Oh, and when the light on the street had that particular Pacific Northwest quality of being wet and bright simultaneously. She had transferred her bar admission to Oregon. She had joined a smaller firm, 8 attorneys, founded by 2 women who had left a larger practice 10 years ago for reasons that rhymed with her own, who did commercial real estate work and estate litigation, who were neither surprised by her background nor deferential about the cases she brought. She had brought the forensic accounting methodology she'd developed with Elena Park and applied it twice already in the first year to trust disputes that had settled quickly, because people who are self-dealing in trust assets are typically not eager to have their financial architecture examined in detail in an Oregon Superior Court. She was good at the work. She had always been good at the work. The difference now was the ratio of cases that felt clean, where the accuracy and the rightness aligned, to cases that felt like simply winning. She was getting better at choosing. On a Thursday evening in early spring, she was at Callum's apartment. A different space, slightly larger, with bookshelves that covered 2 full walls, and the kind of organized clutter that indicated a person who was very precise about some things and not especially precise about others, sitting on his couch with a glass of wine and her laptop, reviewing a brief when he came in from the back room where he'd been writing the Willamette Riparian report, sat down next to her and said, without particular ceremony, "I'd like you to move in." She looked up from the brief. "I know," she said. "You've been thinking about it?" "Since January." "It's April." "Yes," she said. "I was being patient." He looked at her. The lamp beside the couch was doing something warm with the light, and outside the window the city was doing whatever Portland does on a Thursday in April, which is a kind of low, easy hum. "What were you waiting for?" he asked. She thought about the second false summit, about the clarity of continuing from a position of knowing exactly how much trail remained. About the difference between decisions made from fear of stopping and decisions made from understanding of what was ahead. "To be sure I was doing it for the right reasons," she said, "and not just because it was available." He considered this. And I'm sure," she said. He nodded, the nod that meant he'd received the information accurately. "January would have been fine," he said. "I know that now," she said, and went back to the brief. Outside, the city continued. The brief was for a trust challenge in Multnomah County, a situation that rhymed with hers in the broad structural ways: a family trust, an improperly executed power of attorney, a trustee with conflicts of interest, a beneficiary who had spent years not looking at the documents. Her client was a woman in her late 40s who had found out about the irregularities during her mother's final illness, who had called Nora's office the week after the funeral, who had said, in their first meeting, "I don't know how you do this without being angry." Nora had thought about this. "I was angry," she'd said. I spent a long time angry at the right things and the wrong things in approximately equal measure, and it was not a productive ratio. She'd set down the documents. What this requires is being very clear about what's true and very precise about what to do with the true thing. Is that what you do? The client had asked. It's what I'm learning to do, Nora had said. She went back to the brief. Page 12, the fiduciary duty section. She had a formulation she wanted to refine. The language around the trustee's obligation to maintain records of decision-making, and the way that failure to maintain those records created an inference of impropriety rather than just a gap in documentation. The inference, she wrote, flows from the self-created absence of evidence. When a trustee fails to document their decision-making process, the court may reasonably conclude that the undocumented decisions would not have survived documentation. This principle does not require proof of intent. It requires only the recognition that people who act in accordance with their obligations typically do not avoid creating records of those actions. She read this back. She kept it. Outside, Callum had come back to sit beside her, his own laptop open now to something she couldn't see. They sat in the comfortable parallel of two people who were each doing something and were glad of the other's presence without needing to address it directly. The lamp was warm. The coffee cooling in her mug was the good kind. She turned the page.